Episode live of my channel. Sorry, folks, I'm kind of out of sorts with everything going on. Lots of comments, lots of feedback on. And again, I'm going to use this word. I know a lot of people don't like this word, but I'm going to have to use it. It's the unaliving of Charlie Kirk. And again, I think for a lot of us, especially us online who are sharing our opinions, um, it sends shockwaves. It sends shockwaves to what's happening, and I think this is it's such a challenge for all of us right now to really like cope and grasp with this. But that said, I really want us to get into what I think this means because there's many things that it means, and I'm not gonna dissect everything Charlie said because I didn't agree with everything he said, and I certainly didn't always agree with his tactics. But I want to talk specifically about in this live about perhaps why Charlie focused so much of his energy on university campuses across the United States. Because I went to a very, very liberal university here in Toronto, and I can tell you that the conversations that were happening inside school classrooms, on campus, I don't think a lot of people are aware of. A lot of people are just not aware of how left leaning and even how radical some of the opinions that are being shared on campuses are. The books, the readings, the articles, they're very one sided. And for students who already have maybe a predisposition to social justice, to equality, to liberation, fighting for the underclass, the ones that have been mistreated. When you read some of the texts that schools provide, when you read some of the articles and scholarly articles and the scholars that schools decide you should read as a student, it validates that worldview. It validates that perspective. You're 18 years old, you're coming out of high school, and you enter into university. You never really paid taxes to a very high level. You've never had a real job. And so you have this potential opinion of the world that there is an underclass, an underserved group, and they deserve to be served better. And when you see homelessness and when you see poverty, it tugs at your heartstrings. As you get older, you understand these are structures of a capitalist system. But at such a young age, when you're, 17, 18, 19 years old, you're very impressionable. You're very impressionable. And universities across Canada, United States have a tendency to share very left leaning uh, articles and scholars and books that shape your opinion in a very specific way. And again, I didn't agree with Charlie's methods, but perhaps that's why Charlie wanted to go to more universities because he saw that there was this like people were truly not understanding that this book, this scholarly article that they read, is just a perspective. It's just one of different perspectives. And he touched on, again, the issues that as you get older in life, you start understanding there are multiple perspectives on this one topic. And with more life experience, you start seeing it as well. But that's not to say that young people who are 18 to 19 don't understand different perspectives. Of course they do. Of course, you could go down YouTube rabbit holes or internet rabbit holes of understanding the different perspectives that are given to you by your professor. 100% you can. But in university, when your grades and marks are so fundamentally tied to the essays that you write and the exams that you write, there is a sense that you have to kind of play along to get along. You do have to take on that opinion and that framing that your professor provides. And I think the reason why Charlie was on these campuses is that he actually wanted to share with students, like, hey, by the way, like, why do you think you are pro-choice? Why are you in favor of Black Lives Matter? Why are you in favor? Sorry, why are you in favor of um, these social justice issues? When we look at the statistics, it's not necessarily the case that what you're seeing is reality. I will say that again, I didn't agree with his tactics because, you know, I understand from a clearly like social media getting clicks and likes perspective, it's a great way to like clip that up and put it on TikTok, Instagram, etc., and get a lot of likes and shares and views, etc. I get that. It's a business and it's a business model, and it was clearly working for Charlie because he developed millions of followers and probably tens of millions, hundreds of millions of impact across social media. 100%. And in a way, I think that cheapens these arguments a lot. It cheapens it. It takes it away from like really debating the merits of each side, and instead it gets you into these soundbite clickbaity kind of like headlines and stuff. I understand that criticism, and this is why I didn't agree with his methods all the time, and some of his takes on things I didn't agree either. But regardless of his takes or his methods, I think what Charlie was doing was he was touching on again the issue that is so rampant in our universities with again students who are being exposed to very left-leaning and in some people's minds radical thinking. And I don't mean to cheapen the conversation by saying that word radical, but it is very true that there's a radicalization almost on many university campuses on the topics that are being covered. So again, I can't speak on behalf of every university, but here's what I know based on my experience at, again, a very liberal university here in Toronto. So, a perfect example is, I did different courses in political science, and we covered all types of very challenging, difficult conversations. Some that stuck out to me was how the idea of Marxism and socialism were very much normalized as like, of course capitalism is flawed, Marxism and socialism is a better form of organizing our economy. That's a very normal, and when I say normal, normalized viewpoint across many political science um, courses in the university that I attended. So I just want to level the playing field for those that may be less aware who may have never attended a political science course at one of Canada's leading universities. Again, I just want to say Marxism and socialism was a normalized way of understanding that this is a potential solution to the inequity of capitalism. So instead of unpacking the challenges of Marxism and socialism, when I went to university, it was presumed that was the better way forward. And the better way forward was because it was a more egalitarian distribution of wealth. There wasn't the creation of these elite class groups. There weren't these creations, sorry, that's my HVAC. There weren't these creations of pockets of oligopolies and oligarchies. Instead, it was true egalitarian redistribution of wealth. And I'll tell you that across my university experience, that was very normal. Like it was very normal to feel that way about capitalism without unpacking the merits and challenges with all systems. So that to me is a very left-leaning slash radical view of our economic organization, and that we studied researchers and professors and we read books that reinforced capitalism as evil and socialism and Marxism as the alternative and the better alternative. To give you an example, we read books about, there are famous Canadian scholars like Robert Cox and others who again argued very much in favor of Marxism and socialism as this economic model. Now, associated with this, as part of taking political science courses, you also take, social sciences and sociology courses and maybe not anthropology, but like social studies courses, who also talk about the unequal nature of society and the class-based way of looking at society. And again, that there are flaws in a class-based society, of course, and that the better way is egalitarianism, is equality. And again, this tugs at the heartstrings of students who don't have that life experience, who suddenly see all the problems with capitalism, all the problems with our social hierarchy, and then presume that the only way forward is this egalitarian Marxist way of thinking about our society. This is literally what is normal on our campuses today. It's a very normal, like, um, uh, and very much like this is a very accepted view on campus. And I'll also say this, so that's just generally what the kind of frameworks are. Again, problems with capitalism, problems with class-based systems, and the solution being egalitarianism and Marxism, socialism. And it's a bit odd because I think the challenge is something that what a professor said is that, socialism just hasn't been done right. Socialism has not been done right. And as a result, that's what's leading to so many people criticizing the system. It's because it just hasn't been done correctly. It hasn't been implemented correctly. Again, I'm telling you, this is a normalized view on many campuses. So we have this normal view of capitalism as an economic system being wrong, sociology courses reinforcing that class-based systems are wrong. And then here's the kicker too. This is now applied to modern day conflicts, modern day news sources and news issues. And so, how do we understand these? It's through a quote, class based lens. So, when we think of, well, who holds the power? So if there's an issue in society, it's, well, who holds the power? It's what class, what's the ruling class thinking? Because they're driven by money, they're driven by profits. That's again the way in which many on campus are understanding current news events. They're not deciphering the complexity behind current news events and the challenges behind current news events. They're understanding it only through a class-based lens. I was watching a Jubilee did one, like one billionaire versus like 20 like people or something, and this person was saying that China was not an oppressed country, and I was just like flabbergasted. But it reminded me of my time in university when there were books that we had read about, Cuba being perhaps the best implementation of socialism, right? There were books that we had read that China did great on its implementation of its economic. I mean, it was wild. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't, of course, like there needs to be like a discussion about this 100%, but put these countries that are highly oppressive, politically violent countries on pedestals on our campuses. It's that young Canadians today, 18 to 24, are absorbing this material is just something else. Yes, I'm drinking water out of a pint glass, and it's great. So that's why I suspect Charlie was targeting campuses so much. I see Stevie. Stevie, thank you for your love. Says the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. Exactly. That is so true. So one thing that I want to really drive home here is that class based analogies are commonplace on campuses, and that every so often, every few years or every 5 to 10 years, they have to upgrade their class-based analogy because a lot of students are starting to see through it a lot more. So, for example, because I'm aged out of my undergrad and grad school, when I see Gen Z who are just coming out of university, a group of social studies that didn't exist when I was there just a few years, not a few years ago, but a long time ago, was social justice studies. There was no degree at the time called social justice, and even if it was very fringe and like two people took it. You know what I mean? Like I don't ever remember seeing or hearing that phrase in university. Social justice studies. I again, maybe I'm completely blinded to that. But anyways, that's this new form of class-based analogy because social justice, as I understand it, takes on not only the class-based analogy, but then brings in race, brings in gender, brings in ethnicity, brings in, a whole multitude of different lenses to then look through the world and the current news events through that social justice lens. That it's not enough that you're poor and it's not enough that you're rich and poor. It's also that you're a woman. It's that you're black or brown. It's that you're disabled, that you're challenged in some way, that you're a member of an underprivileged class, in addition to you being, a poor or middle class or the working class will never get it. That analogy uh, of Marxism needs to evolve on campus. And so, again, they bring in more lenses to then look through the world. Now, the limitation, obviously, everyone can see the limitation with this, right? The limitation is you're not treating people as individuals, you're treating them in this class based analogy. And proponents of these class based analogies would say, well, here are all the examples of the elite doing things, and here are all the examples of the underclasses feeling the effects of the elite, and one is cost of living and inflation, and like the list goes on. And again, the if you take it at face value, there's great merit to that. And I think the reason these universities um, do this is because they understand these are malleable minds, 18 to 24, not enough life experience. Universities have been left leaning for a very long time, at least here in North America. And so I do think that there's actually a concerted effort to and strategy to do this on campus. Um, Campuses don't want you to know this, but they are also a business and they run on dollars and cents and they understand what needs to happen in order for them to keep building that revenue, which are international students, which we can get into at another time. But all that to say, um, again, it's very normal on campuses to look at current events through a social justice lens, right? Class plus race plus ethnicity plus gender. Now, what does this all mean? Why does this matter? Well, it's because again of what I think of Charlie Kirk and again why he brought his brand to so many campuses. Um, his brand was brought to so many campuses because I think what he was seeing was there's this opportunity for us to talk about things and break down this social justice lens of looking at the world. Because I'm sure Charlie, much like many of us, have seen on Instagram and TikTok and even YouTube that there are many younger people who are espousing views that are dangerous views, because there are a warped view of the world that actually exists. And there are many examples of this warped view, at least as I see it. One is clearly that um, a race-based lens can justify a lot of discrimination. Discrimination's hard. It's a really hard thing to unpack, um, but it's very complex. And many scholars, many lawyers, many researchers in the field know that this is harder and harder to isolate and unpack and say first for certain that this other person had underlying race-based motives preventing that person from obtaining, let's say a higher position, a higher job, a bigger salary. Using strictly a race-based lens is actually very difficult. It's actually almost impossible to truly prove, say, discrimination in the workplace. If you're feeling discrimination in the workplace, it's really hard. And so, because of that, and the reason why it's hard is because it's easy to see a race-based lens by saying, well, your board is made up of all white men. But when we get into the nitty-gritty, we start asking questions that we need to unpack. So, for example, say a company has a board and it's all white men, and there's no people of color on this board. A race-based lens would say, and a class-based lens, going back to what we talked about earlier, says there are structures in place to keep that class and that race down, full stop. But if you just do a simple, variable analysis or variable data analysis, you have to look at multiple data points. So another data point is, are people of color applying to board positions? Um, and then if that answer is yes, and they're still getting denied, then you look into their qualifications and you say, okay, like were they qualified? Do they have experience? If yes, then you say, okay, like who comprised the interview panel? If yes, then okay, we can start seeing that there's a race-based decision at play here, or there's a higher probability that that could be a factor into the circumstance. But you can see it gets much higher. To be honest, what I think might be happening is not many people of color are applying to board positions. Now, let me explain why, because a lot of people don't even know this. As a person of color, and I'm not speaking on behalf of all people of color, right? But I'm going to tell you this. As a person of color, my parents were never on any boards. My grandparents weren't in Canada. I grew up with a grandmother on both sides. One of my grandmothers passed away when I was younger. My other grandmother passed away just about a year ago. But they weren't on boards and they weren't, like these big C suite executives. They came to Canada in their 60s and 60s. So, whereas if I came from a family whose parents and grandparents and great grandparents all sat on boards and there was a lot of history here, chances are, and I bet you there's research to prove this, chances are I'm more likely to see myself on a board at a certain stage in my career. And I'll tell you why. It's because without you even knowing it, say you're just working away and you're doing your thing, your family will spur you along either in their words or actions to help you like think about, hey, have you thought about going to the board? Like, have you thought about that? You've done the work, da da da. But as a person of color, you may not think that you're good enough, so you may not even be applying. And again, a lot of people don't really know this, and I'd love to know if there's stats behind this. I'm sure there are, but I bet you there's a very low percentage of people of color applying to board positions. That's just my assumption. Um, but I bet you that's probably a big part of why that is an issue. And again, this type of critical thinking and research is not happening on campuses. The analysis stops when they see white people or they see like a race or gender comprising the majority of a board or an organization or a government or et cetera, et cetera. The analysis stops at that point. It just says white men making decisions for women, for black people, for brown people, for indigenous people, et cetera. Full stop, it's over. And then the analysis says, well, we have all these examples. And I think, to be honest, like that does such a grave injustice to critical thought, because critical thought is always asking the why. There's actually a great leadership playbook. Um, I think it's in Lean Six Sigma, where to get to the problem, you have to ask 5 whys. And I kind of like that, you know? So if you say the board is made up of of white people, white men, excuse me, why? It's race. That it just ends the story right there, right? But really, you have to go down why, some more to then understand. And again, we have to look at people who are applying. Why are they applying? Are they applying? No, they're not applying. But if they are and they're still getting rejected, then you have to start building a case for some form of discrimination that may be occurring. But again, it gets harder and harder to prove the more and more you start asking those questions. And that's the critical piece that's missing on campuses. Students should very well be understanding the 5 whys or challenging the race-based understanding uh, uh, of of these items, but they're not. And I think this is exactly why Charlie Kirk is targeting so many, or did target so many campuses, because he saw the madness that was happening. He saw exactly that, the stuff that was happening, and he wanted to make sure that this was, at least a different perspective was being shared on campus. Um, the other thing I wanted to mention, I know I've been going on for a while just about some of the challenges on campus. Hopefully, everyone can hear me. Um, we're just the the idea of, and I want to touch on this because I think this is something that's coming up a lot, and that's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is it's a very challenging topic, and there's something to be said as to why freedom of speech has not been a cornerstone of ancient civilizations. I say this with some trepidation because freedom of speech is a very new phenomena in our recorded human history, right? Like 1776, sure, like we use the American Constitution onwards. That's only 250 years of recorded government history. You know, we think about Socrates. Socrates was the father, say, of democracy and freedom of speech, and he was killed, unalived, for that, for exactly that, for the ability to question. And if you read some of Socrates' dialects and his like dialogues that he had with other people, it's really interesting. Like how he would, undertake the 5 whys, or he would really get into it with someone else. But he would always tell him, he's like, I don't dislike you, the person. I'm here to challenge the opinion and let's unpack this, And so when we think of freedom of speech and we think of it enshrined into the Constitution, enshrined into the Charter of Rights, and then you see someone like Charlie do his thing and people have these vitriolic reactions to him, as they rightfully or wrongfully should, and then something like what happened yesterday happens, then you start thinking, okay, like, how could the state ensure that that freedom is always protected? Like, do we need to have a bulletproof dome? Do we have to have like completely, as I know a lot of people say, safe spaces? But how does the state actually protect free speech? And the way they do that is through the Constitution, is through these laws and regs. But as a society, do we agree with freedom of speech? And I say that actually very openly and questioning that because I don't know. And I say that because when we start thinking about what's happening in our society, it's very easy for us to think of complex issues through a frame that someone else has made, and someone else has basically said, this is the way in which we're going to understand this one issue. And the best example I have is during the 2020 when the George Floyd protests happened. It was like this big issue, this issue of George Floyd, as complex as that one issue is, there's this framework where we're only going to understand that one issue through this framework and nothing else. Now, if I am truly a believer and a proponent of free speech, if I truly believe what free speech is, I would question that framework. I would be like, well, is that, but I noticed when we did, those voices were silenced very quickly and labeled all types of things, which allowed me to then infer that our societies aren't necessarily proponents of free speech. We're proponents of a speech that is very much tailored within a framework. And maybe, just maybe, it goes back to class based analogy, right? Like bigger powers are determining the structure and how we understand these issues. Um, and we start fitting ourselves inside the structure of how they've understood these issues to be. And then we start arguing with each other based on that structure, not realizing we're all pawns on this chessboard, if that makes any sense. So maybe I can make this more clear. George Floyd's, and what happened to George Floyd, traumatic, of course, 100%. But there's a lot of complexity to that whole scenario involving Derek Chauvin and the whole policing structure and George Floyd's background and how they, and the knee on the neck. Like there's a lot of things at play in that one specific situation. I'm certain there are many similar situations like George Floyd that are happening all the time. But let's just use that one example. The complexity associated with that is a lot. And because it does happen quite it happens, there's a lot of complexity that I think the general public is aware and understanding of. Like they understand the complexity behind a lot of these issues. But with George Floyd, there's something different that happened because it was understood through a very specific lens that was repeated again and again and again and again in like in different media outlets, um, and it was repeated over and over and over again. And that spurred the Black Lives Matter movement, or at least amplified it. And it took away our critical lens because it was so the structure of how it was understood was repeated so frequently that even the best critical minds were relegated to being very silent and quiet about the issue for fear of funding and research, etc., or being on quote the wrong side of history. And it's not just George Floyd. Think of climate change. Think of the pandemic, think of all the issues that are happening. There are certain ones that percolate to the top, and a framework is established to understanding that issue. And free speech, as I understand it to be, is challenging that framework or agreeing with it or disagreeing with it or being neutral about it. Free speech is your ability to unpack and ask the why. And I don't know if our society really values that why, that ability to say, why? Because it's unsettling. It's unsettling to many people to ask the why. To many people, you may come across as racist, as misogynistic, as homophobic, as every other word you can think of. But it's not that, it's the curiosity that we're chasing. It's the why behind it, so that we can build a better system of understanding this issue that's incorporating these different elements. And if we don't have an answer to the why, that's okay. It's okay to say, I don't know. That's messed up, but I don't have the answer to that. And that's okay. And I think that's why Charlie Kirk, to bring this all back, was on campuses doing his thing because he was trying to, and again, I didn't agree with his means and very clickbaity things 100%. But I think Charlie at his core and his essence was trying to get, or at least trying to hopefully get, at to the why. Like, why are you this? Why do you think of this in this way, in this lens? Why are you applying this lens? Have you thought about X, Y, and Z? And he was very like bombastic about X, Y, and Z, which is very off-putting to a lot of people. But at the very least, he was exposing students to new and different ways of thinking about the same social issues. So I've been talking for a while about this. I know there's still a lot to unpack with Charlie and everything that happened, and I'm sure there's tons of social media posts about it already, and all the new data that's coming out. But again, even with what's happening right now with Charlie, unpack how we're framing these issues, how the coverage is, what they're choosing to focus on, what are the words that they're using. This matters. It's critical thinking, and critical thinking should be honed on university campuses, not frameworked, if that makes sense. Folks, I'm going to end it there for tonight. Again, I hope you're all doing well. If you definitely want, share, subscribe, tell all your friends. Again, my name is Christopher Balkrin. This is the place where we engage in open-ended, true free speech, where we're talking about some of the biggest things that are going on. And I had this whole script to talk about immigration, continue my series, but with everything happening, I decided to pivot. So I hope you're enjoying this, and I'll definitely catch you in the next one. Have a great night, everyone. Take care.